My name's Tom Mills. I'm a lecturer at Aston University. My book is called The BBC, A Myth of a Public Service, and it's about the BBC and its organisational culture and its relationship with powerful groups in the state.
It's the most trusted media in the country. It's very influential, but also I think from the perspective of media reform, you know, in a sense we don't really want to reinvent the wheel. This is a public infrastructure which is in place, which belongs to us, which should be doing all the things which it claims to be doing. I think it makes sense to talk about two related areas of the BBC. The first is its news and current affairs output, and the second it's sort of the background to that, which is the broader kind of political economy of the BBC and the wider kind of media ecology within which it operates. The first element is pretty consistently reflected the interests of powerful groups in society, marginalising critical perspectives pretty much since its very beginnings. You know, it goes back to 1926 and the general strike. So it's always been orientated towards the British state, officialdom, elite interests. It's funded by the public, which is often used by the BBC's sort of champions in the liberal media and in academia as being evidence that it's independent. But you know, the real issue there isn't where the money comes from; it's who controls the money, and that's the government.
The BBC is much more connected to the British state, to elite interests in British society, than the public, essentially, and that's the broad argument of the book. The other element of the book is exploring how the BBC changed as British society changed.
Pockets of critical journalism, particularly investigative reporting, sort of socially conscious news and current affairs, did start to develop under the influence of 60s culture, particularly in the 1970s and 1980s. A lot of that was heavily criticised by the Thatcher government, and a lot of it was rolled back progressively in the late 80s and early 90s, something which was signalled by the departure of Alistair Milne, who was Director General, basically. And it marked the beginning of a shift where editorial policy became much more centralised, much more controlled, and the BBC became much more risk-averse. So the BBC became much more pro-business. There's quite an explicit change that takes place, and it was driven by business-orientated leadership. First of all, John Burt and then Greg Dyke. John Burt, who was Director General of the BBC during the 1990s, was a neoliberal in, I mean, the narrowest sense of the word. I mean, this isn't really acknowledged in any of the literature, but he used to spend time at the Institute for Economic Affairs, which was like, for those who don't know, was kind of the seminal Thatcherite neoliberal think tank. He was very close to a guy called Peter Jay, who was economics editor at the Times, who was very influential in disseminating monetarist thinking in the 1970s. He wrote parts of Callaghan's speech about not being able to spend your way out of a crisis. He introduced an internal market at the BBC, which was modelled on the NHS, and what the initiative of the 1990s, which was very much in the spirit at the time, was about dividing the BBC into buyers and sellers, right? So the BBC would have to, if you were working at the BBC, you have to sell your content to someone else at the BBC, and you trade with each other as part of the much wider neoliberal form of public service. The reason I mention that is that it fundamentally transformed the culture of the BBC. It became much more entrepreneurial, as they liked to say, but much more business-orientated, much more orientated towards costs, and much more integrated into the capitalist marketplace. The exception to that is news and current affairs, and in this area, I mean, there have been cuts and so on, but in any case, a lot of the reporting, as I'm sure we're all familiar, has been done by people drawn from, you know, the upper middle class, elite strata, mainly Oxford, Cambridge, privately educated people. This again was part of the shift that took place under John Burt in the 1990s. A very elitist reporting patterns.
The media is very central to democracy and how a democracy functions.
The woman from the Green Party, I mean, yeah, you know, this has been a big problem. You know, in some ways, the previous success of the Greens, the sort of surge that they had, you know, was the precursor of a lot of politics we're seeing now, which is, you know, the breakdown of the two-party system, and a feeling that, you know, existing politics is unrepresentative, and the BBC is still very much embedded within that politics. And, you know, they don't seem to be able to respond to the kind of political tumults that are taking place. Now, it is their obligation to do that. I think one of the really important things which people should be doing is thinking about in the medium to long term, how can we develop policy initiatives which might be able to transform the BBC and thereby transform the wider media ecology, if you like. And I think what's quite interesting when you look at these things like producer choice and the recent competitive revolution is that what they're trying to do here is they're trying to shape the people's working conditions and the broader political economy of the media through this process of commissioning and integration into the market. And I think some of this would be very useful to people who want to develop a more democratic and egalitarian media, because the commissioning process could potentially build in certain requirements for partnerships. It could be used instead of funding and subsidising corporations to actually supporting independent, non-profit and community media. And I think that's the kind of thinking and the direction which we need to be pushing. Now, in terms of, you know, should we just boycott the BBC? You know, I don't think we should. I mean, I listen to the BBC and I watch it, you know, for research. But actually, the thing is that what goes on in the BBC, it's not just kind of annoying. I mean, these do have material effects in the real world. So if the BBC reported differently, policies would be rolled out in a different fashion. It's not just that, you know, this isn't just a sort of ideological issue. The way in which the media is structured, the way in which the BBC is structured has a material effect on politics, which has a material effect on people's lives. And if we just simply ignore it and give up that space, I mean, you know, we are ceding a sphere of political contestation to the elites, I think.
The BBC shouldn't be reflecting the interests of one narrow section of society, that it should be reflecting the broad society as a whole and reflecting plural views.